If you've ever experienced any sort of prolonged suffering or chronic illness, you know that feeling of isolation and hopelessness. You know what it feels like to be unwanted, to feel forgotten, or feel like just a burden to the ones you love. I know what it feels like to feel completely and utter hopelessness. I've watched door after door close in my life, and I've been dismissed by doctor after doctor and have gotten just more and more sick. So I hope today, if you've experienced that same feeling, that you feel seen, that you feel like you are not walking through this suffering alone. If you are new here, welcome to the Still I Rejoice podcast. I am your host, Seisha. I love the story of Corrie ten Boom when her and her sister Betsy were in a Nazi concentration camp, and Corrie looks at Betsy and says, "How will we ever share the love of God after all of this suffering?" And Betsy says, "Corrie, they will listen to us because we've been there." And if you've ever tried to talk to someone who has not experienced what you've gone through, their words of encouragement are nice, but they don't resonate with you. But when you talk to somebody, let's say battling cancer or dealing with the loss of a child or chronic illness or chronic pain, they share their testimony with you, and all of a sudden it speaks to you and you find encouragement in their words. So today I want to talk to you about a woman in the Bible who doesn't have a name, but she's referred to as the woman with the issue of blood. And as I read this story recently, the Lord really took hold of my heart, and I saw so much of myself in this woman. And if you're dealing with pain or suffering or chronic illness, I think you will too. Much like Betsy said, when you've gone through something, people will listen. And this woman in the Bible endured so much suffering and isolation, rejection, that it's really easy to place yourself in her shoes and see yourself in her. The events of the story are recorded in 3 different Gospels: Matthew 9, Mark 5, and Luke 8. I'm going to be referencing a few of these chapters because it really helps us unpack everything that this woman went through. But the majority of where we'll be reading from is in Mark 5. So if you want to follow along, that's where I'll be reading the story from. I'm actually going to be starting in verse 21, which is a few verses before the story actually starts, because we catch Jesus in the middle of something, and I think it's really important that we see this. So starting in verse 21, it says, "And when Jesus was passed over again by ship unto the other side, much people gathered unto him, and he was nigh unto the sea. And behold, there came one of the rulers of the synagogue, Jairus by name. And when he saw him, he fell at his feet, and besought him greatly, saying, My daughter lieth at the point of death. I pray thee, come and lay thy hands on her, that she may be healed, and she shall live. And Jesus went with him, and much people followed him and thronged him. And a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years, and had suffering many things of physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse. When she had heard of Jesus, came in the press behind, and touched his garment. For she said, If I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. And straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press, and said, Who touched my clothes? And his disciples said unto him, Thou seest the multitude thronging thee, and sayest thou, Who touched me? And he looked round about to see her that had done this thing. But the woman, fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him, and told him all the truth. And he said unto her, Daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace, and be whole of thy plague. The first thing that I want to point out is what Jesus was in the middle of when this woman touches him, because I think when we suffer for an extended period of time, it can start to affect our earthly relationships. Maybe our friends or our family or our spouse treats you like a burden, or maybe that's just the feeling and perception that you've placed on yourself because whatever you're going through is unavoidable or inconvenient. Maybe you feel hard to love and to be around because of your circumstances. And whether someone has placed those thoughts on you or you just feel that way, it starts to spill over into your spiritual life. You start to think, I believe in God and I do my best to believe that He's good to me. But when you've prayed about the same thing over and over, with no answer. You start to question how personally God is involved in your circumstances. Where you once had complete faith that God loved and cared about you individually and all the tiny details of your life, suddenly you feel like maybe I'm not as important as I thought. Maybe because I'm bedridden or depressed or sick or just have to stay home, that my life isn't as valued. And you start to feel like an inconvenience and an interruption more than a child of God. So when we look at this story and we see Jesus off to perform this huge miracle, he's about to save a very sick child who is the daughter of a known ruler, and ultimately she ends up dying before Jesus even reaches her because this woman stops him. But the crowds are pressing in because they want to see this incredible miracle that Jesus is going to do. A miracle, honestly, that will make a lot of people believe and further the kingdom. But in the midst of all of this, a woman touches him, and that faith, that simple act of desperation from a nameless, unclean woman was enough for Jesus to stop and make time for her. She wasn't an inconvenience. She wasn't a burden. It never says Jesus felt interrupted or annoyed. Jesus stops and makes time for this woman, not only to acknowledge her and heal her, but to restore her dignity in front of a crowd, and calls her daughter, showing her that she is loved and cared for like a father loves his daughter. And I just want to stop and say, if you're in that place where you feel like you're a burden, your circumstances or your limitations feel burdensome to others, it's a lie. It's a lie that Satan has whispered in your ear to make the love of God look small, to make a relationship with Jesus seem uncaring and surface level, and it's not true. And as I prayed over this passage, this is what I felt the Holy Spirit really wanted me to drive home. And I don't believe if you're listening to this, it's by accident. God loves you, sees you, he hears you, and he cares about every single circumstance in your life in the deepest ways possible. Whether your prayers are answered or not, whether you feel him or not, he's not a surface level God. I want to pick up in verse 25. It says, "And a certain woman which had an issue of blood 12 years, and had suffered many things of many physicians, and had spent all that she had, and was nothing bettered, but rather grew worse." I want to point out that 12 years is a long time to deal with suffering. People often say that 12 years goes by in a blink of an eye, life is so fast. But when you're suffering and you're waking up day after day facing the same pain, the same unanswered prayers, it feels long and it feels unbearable. So 12 years is a very long time. Next thing I want you to understand is the isolation this woman would have felt. This bleeding issue she had would have made her unclean under the law and would have made her completely isolated. Anything or anyone she touched would have been made unclean. She couldn't be around people, and no one wanted to be around her. And I truly believe isolation is such a silent killer. This is something that I've experienced personally on a much deeper level than I'd care to admit. And I think this applies to a lot of us. Any sort of suffering can cause us to retract from the world, and some of us have a choice, but some of us don't. If you are bedbound, if you don't have a choice, isolation can feel completely hopeless. And I love that Mark points this out specifically. It says she suffered many things of many physicians. The Greek word here means to endure pain, harm, or distress. Oftentimes in ancient times, they could use painful treatments, but I think this is relevant to us because if you experienced chronic illness, you've had doctors gaslight you. You've experienced the emotional humiliation, the ongoing disappointment of never really getting answers, and it can be absolutely soul-crushing. Not only did she not get better, she gets worse and spent literally everything she had, all of her finances, to get answers. And so many of us are in debt and drowning from medical bills, and we still don't have hope. And I think there's so many of us that can relate to this because I think all of these things combined, it's intended to show us that not only after prolonged suffering and exhausting all of her resources and complete just loss of human solution, does this woman reach out for Jesus. But Jesus never once condemns her for being her last hope. He never says, "Why didn't you come to me sooner?" He honors her faith right where she's at. Let's pick up in verse 27. It says, when she had heard of Jesus, came in the press behind and touched his garment, for she said, if I may touch but his clothes, I shall be whole. I want to jump back to Matthew's account in chapter 9 and in verse 21. It says, for if she said within herself, if I may touch his garment, I shall be whole. And I love the way he says, she said within herself. This verb written in the Greek means an ongoing or repeated action. There was no, maybe this will work. It was a consistent repetition of faith saying, if I touch his garment, I will be whole. So we see this woman has a renewing of her mind, a transition from hopelessness to hope, a hope and belief that Jesus truly was the answer. And this is so important because when she touches, Jesus says, it is your faith that made you whole. And this action is what healed her. So let's pick up back in verse 29. It says, and straightway the fountain of her blood was dried up, and she felt in her body that she was healed of that plague. And Jesus, immediately knowing in himself that virtue had gone out of him, turned him about in the press and said, who touched my clothes? This is so interesting because this is the first time recorded in the Bible that Jesus physically felt virtue leave him. Now, virtue just means a divine power, but it wasn't a loss of strength. Jesus is a fountain, so his healing power was just freely flowing from him. So it was her faith laying hold of Christ that made her whole. I love what Matthew Henry has to say about this. He says, Christ has an inexhaustible fullness. The more he gives, the more he has to give. So Jesus was already ready and able to heal her. The connection was her willingness and the readiness in her faith. In verse 31, we're going to pick up and it says, and his disciples said unto him, thou seest the multitude thronging thee, and sayest thou, who touched me? When he looked round about to see her that had done this thing, but the woman fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her, came and fell down before him and told him all the truth. Of course, Jesus knew exactly who touched him, and he wasn't actually looking for her. I think it's funny that the disciples even play into this question and think he actually doesn't know who touched him. But it says the woman was fearing and trembling, knowing what was done in her. Now, the fear she was feeling was very real. This wasn't just like a social anxiety. This woman was considered unclean. She was not supposed to be in public, let alone sneaking up on Jesus and touching people. She had broken the law and was preparing to be rejected and judged. But more than that, it says she was trembling because she knew what was done in her. This is because the holiness of God is real. The restoration in her body and her spirit was a physical and spiritual change. She felt the transformation inside her. So she steps forward and tells the truth. And again, Jesus already knew what had happened, but Jesus is not going to allow her faith to be hidden or full of fear. He wants her life to be full of freedom and joy and for her testimony to be used. So he calls her out to restore what has been taken from her. And then it says in verse 34, he said unto her, daughter, thy faith hath made thee whole. Go in peace and be whole of thy plague. He calls her daughter. By simply calling her daughter, he restores her body, her dignity, her place in the community, and ultimately her relationship with God. He breaks every chain that she had in this life. And I love that Jesus says, thy faith hath made thee whole. Not my power, not my goodness, not my mercy. Honestly, the humility and love Jesus shows is astounding, but he also gives the power of healing back into the hands of the sinner, making the point that this is your choice. Then Jesus says these profound words, go in peace and be made whole of thy plague, making the distinction that the woman had been healed physically and spiritually, and she doesn't have to live in the fear anymore. And I think this is what a lot of us are missing. The hopelessness and the fear has turned to faithlessness, and we wander in the wilderness wondering what happened to the goodness and the mercy of God. And this woman's life gives us the most relatable circumstances and an unbelievable outcome from a choice. This woman could have easily said, it's been 12 years and no one has been able to help me. I've felt hopeless in that way at times. And what makes this man any different? I'm wasting my time and I'll stay home. But her decision to renew her mind, to repeatedly put her faith and trust that if I can just touch Jesus, I'll be whole. And I think it's high time that we remove ourselves from isolation and give all that we have into one who can do all things. That we look at our circumstances and our suffering and say, come what may, I'm reaching for Jesus. And is it easy? No. And it took a lot for this woman to do what she did. And she quite literally has made history for stepping out on her faith. But I do believe we could see rapid change physically and spiritually if we just believed that touching Jesus would make all the difference. So I want to challenge you to put down your fear, to not let the feeling of hopelessness creep in and consume your judgment. Whatever thoughts you have on your circumstances, surrender them to Jesus. He's able to do more than you could possibly ask or think, and he wants to heal you, whether it be spiritually or physically, whatever his will is, he wants to heal you. I love you guys, and I hope you found today encouraging. I hope you have the best rest of your week, and I will see you in my next episode. Bye.